When you think of Chinese communism, you think of iconic images such as the Red Guards violently waving their little red books, Chinese peasants starving in the fields, and the National Assembly applauding Mao as he enters the building. Yet, as you look at China today, these are likely not the images that come to mind. Instead, we often think of the skyscrapers in Shanghai and Guangzhou, the smog in Beijing, or maybe even something as simple as TikTok. And so these iconic, stereotypically communist images from the 1960s and 70s seem a far cry from these seemingly corporate images of China today. And in today's video, we're going to see how China actually went through the transition of being the most hardcore of all the communist nations in the world to one that is barely communist today at all. We left last episode with Deng Xiaoping cleverly ousting Hua Guofeng after Mao's death to become the unofficial leader of China. And so in the 1980s, it was time for new leadership. It was time for a new economy, and as Deng Xiaoping himself put it, it was time for socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Hello there.
Okay, so if you did miss the last episode, you can catch up here, but Deng Xiaoping ended up as the unofficial leader of China. Now, the official chairman was actually a guy named Hua Guofeng, and Deng was officially an advisor, but as Hu himself admitted, Deng was the supreme decision maker in the CCP. And so then, the last key name we need to know for this episode is a guy called Zhao Ziyang. And so Deng Xiaoping made Hua Guofeng the man in charge of political decisions, and Zhao Ziyang the man in charge of economic decisions. Of course, both answered to Deng, and so it was Deng who was wielding the power, but each were divided into their relative positions. But China needed urgent reform. In 1978, 250 million Chinese were living in absolute poverty, and worse for the CCP, their neighbours Taiwan, who remember Mao defeated in war, seemed to be faring economically better than the mainland. The 1970s was also an interesting time for Taiwan because their leader, Chiang Kai-shek, died in 1975, and his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, took over, and unlike his father, he actually allowed opposition parties to operate with some degree of freedom. At this point of history as well, the USSR was on the verge of what we call democratization, and Mikhail Gorbachev was not far from advocating that the USSR was to become more of a democratic nation. And so for Deng, this was a bit of a problem. China had been faring poorly since 1958, and so compared with firstly Taiwan, who was prospering, but then also with Gorbachev abandoning hardcore communism and moving towards democracy, it seemed pretty clear that Maoism had failed. And so Deng had to be tactical about the approach forward, and so we saw the beginning of Deng Xiaoping's thought. For Deng, Gorbachev was making a terrible mistake by reforming the political system before the economy, because if you give poor people democratic rights, they'll simply vote you out for making them poor. And so for Deng, if any other reform was to take place, people first had to get rich, and at all costs, China had to avoid following Taiwan's path towards democracy. And so breaking completely from Mao's idea that everyone ought to be equal in terms of their wealth, and that wealth was a form of sin, Deng went on record saying, "If we don't change, we are at a dead end. Whoever doesn't reform will have to step down. Some people will get rich first." And so the Dengist reform started to take place. In terms of agriculture, China had experienced 2 decades of reoccurring famines, and so Deng wanted to incentivize more agriculture being produced. Farmers were given quotas of crops that had to be yielded to the government, but any surplus crops could be sold on the private market, and so this incentivized farmers to grow more. Ziyang and Deng also upped the state payment of grain by 20%, and the price per ton of grain was either increased or decreased depending on how much grain that farmer produced. Ziyang and Deng also lowered the prices on farming equipment such as tractors, and with some exceptions such as Hebei that was badly affected by natural disasters in 1980, Chinese agricultural output increased from 8 to 10% each year from 1978 to 1984. Secondly, Deng put the idea that some will get rich first into action as China established a set of special economic zones. Basically, these economic zones did not have to follow the same rules as the rest of China. And so the first zone that was set up was Shenzhen, and so companies in Shenzhen had lower tax rates and received government subsidies, meaning it was cheaper to produce goods. Now, the goal of special economic zones was not for the Chinese companies to produce more, but actually for foreign companies to set up in China. If companies set up in China, they could then tax those companies and have other nations purchase off them and inject money into the economy. Remember, China was dirt poor and they needed an injection of capital to get the economy up and going. And so the zones appeared to work pretty well. By 1985, there were over a dozen of these zones, including Shanghai and Guangzhou, and annual exports increased from $10 billion in 1978 to $25 billion in 1985, meaning that China was indeed attracting a lot of foreign money. Their export rate was also increasing at an average of 30% every year. This also had a multiplying effect across the nation because of the haiku system. And basically this system tied people down to their hometowns, but people could get temporary migrant status. And so these migrants would go and work and get better wages in these SEZs, and then bring that money back to their hometown. Thirdly, Deng and Xiang increased this injection of capital by securing loans from the IMF and the World Bank, including a $200 million loan for microcomputers. Finally, the commune and brigade enterprises in the towns were replaced by the town and village enterprises. Previously, the old CBEs functioned as locally run businesses that had to produce steel, cement, fertilizer, power, and farm tools. However, the new TVEs were allowed to produce whatever goods they wanted and to sell to any district they wanted as well. And so then they catered to the market to make profit. It pushed China more towards a consumerist economy, and they were responsible for the employment of 100 million Chinese people. China's relationship with the world also strengthened in the 1980s. Having been let into the UN in 1971 and having begun its relationship with the USA in 1972, China slowly came out of relative isolation. Having heavily criticised China for much of his pre-presidential career, Ronald Reagan actually invited Zhao Ziyang to the White House, and tensions between China and the Soviet Union also started to cool. The Plaza Accord of 1985 increased the value of the Japanese yen, meaning that it was less viable to import from, and so other countries turned to China's export market instead. And then finally, in 1984, Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping came to an agreement that Hong Kong would officially become part of China in 1997 under the two systems one country agreement, though Thatcher certainly didn't take a personal liking to Deng. And so if you have a look at this graph, you'll notice that the GDP per capita explodes when China joins the WTO in 2001, but if you look closely at 1978, you'll notice that's when the trajectory started to change. Deng and Xiang's policies were far from perfect. China experienced bad inflation in the late 1980s, and there were huge issues of corruption and nepotism from provincial bosses and key CCP members. They were also more experimental than deliberate, and whatever worked was what Deng and Xiang stuck with. But nonetheless, China's journey to becoming an economic powerhouse really started with Deng's declaration that China was practicing socialism with Chinese characteristics. And with more money, the people certainly weren't complaining about the changes. The only issue was that they wanted more changes. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for our next episode where we see Deng confronted with the reality that Chinese citizens don't just want economic freedom, but political freedom too. And we see one of the most eventful days in modern political history. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.